Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're delighted that you're interested in our research on the external workforce. My name is Karen Snow, and I'm a member of the research team. I'll moderate our discussion today. We'll share our top-line findings with you from our research and give you perspective on what we believe enterprises should be thinking about to realize more value from their external workforce. And as we go through the discussion, if you have questions, please type them into the chat window. We'll save some time at the end to address them. And we also want you to know that we'll post this webcast to our website, so it will be available to your colleagues who are not able to join today. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to do introductions. Our two speakers today are Molly Spitera and Chris Scullin. Molly is the Chief Marketing Officer and Research Lead for SAP Fieldglass, and Chris Scullin leads Professional Services for SAP Fieldglass in Asia Pacific. Molly and Chris, welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Chris, would you please explain the role of professional services at Fieldglass? It may not be a concept that everyone is familiar with.
Sure. So professional services across Fieldglass do the initial scoping, understanding what your requirements are, implementing the solution, but then more engaging with you in the longer term from an account services perspective to drive the overall success of your program. So talking about benchmarking, adding value to your contingent workforce management programs, real focus on thought leadership and of course doing things or working with things like this Oxford research study to get the best you can. So it's about making sure that your program doesn't stagnate and that you keep getting the benefits, and that's really what professional services is about, keeping it moving forward.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And some quick context for our discussion today, just some definitions, so we're all anchoring on the same concepts. There are two ways that companies get work done today. One is internally via their employees, or two, they engage an external workforce. And when we think of an external workforce, we think it's either individuals, such as contractors and freelancers, and it's also services providers. So think of all the people-based services that are delivered to your organizations. They could be consulting firms, they could be IT outsourcers, marketing agencies, and they could be companies that provide workers to your factory. They could manage and maintain your facilities. They could run your call centers. So it's a very broad category. So what we're going to talk with you today is about the study that we conducted with Oxford Economics. And we had three objectives. One, we wanted to understand, what are the labor trends today vis-a-vis workers and the external workforce. Secondly, we wanted to understand how are enterprises using the external workforce. And third, we wanted to get at this idea, this concept of what is the impact on business and financial performance? How is the external workforce relevant to organizations today? Molly, would you tell us a little bit more about the research and who we surveyed?
Sure. We talked to senior executives. In fact, a third of these executives were from the C-suite, and they cut across 16 industries, more than 15 countries. And we really sought to take a look at these larger enterprises. In fact, we looked at organizations with more than $5 billion in revenue and greater than, and so a fairly large and comprehensive study in terms of the size and the scale.
Okay, so why don't we do this now? Let's pop into our top-line findings for the research. And Molly, why don't you take us through our core themes that we uncovered?
Yes, thank you. So I think this is really what anchored our key findings here. In particular, the first theme is really the rise of the multi-channel workforce. And we call it this because, because the research showed that organizations are getting their work done through a number of different channels, contractors, consulting firms, service providers, and of course, non-payroll workers really kind of break down into freelancers, contractors, et cetera. But all of these channels really, make up the entire multi-channel workforce, and this is expected to grow in the coming years. So it is significant, and it is growing. The other thing that we saw was that it is about the core, and it might have been in years past that we thought that the external workforce was really operating more at the edges of the organization, but in fact, what our research showed is that they are operating at the core of the business, and it is fundamental to essentially keeping the lights on. And so we'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. And the other thing I think was interesting is that, while cost is always a chief concern, and it will always be among the top considerations, it is actually just one of the drivers. And there were others that were similar and rated similarly and just as important and really what we saw was that it is essential to improving business performance and meeting a range of goals. So without the external workforce, there's a number of things that these organizations are saying that they simply just could not do. So that is a big shift from years ago when we might have thought about external workers really in a staff augmentation role. That is no longer the case. It is now really shifted. The other thing is, visibility is everything. And, we've always talked about, if you can't see it, you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and then you can't really derive the business benefits from it. And so that's essentially what what this theme is really about. And so, in effect, what we determined is that most senior executives in the study really do not have a good grasp of how many external workers they have, let alone what they're paying them, the quality of their work, are they certified, what access do they have to their facilities and systems, regulatory and internal compliance, et cetera. These are all things that you really have to know in terms of the individuals that you are entrusting to get work done on your behalf. So visibility really is everything. So these are the 4 key themes, and we'll get into more detail on this in a few minutes, Karen.
Okay. So, Chris, how do you see these findings resonating with people when you're talking with customers and potential customers in Australia? What's your take on their reaction?
Yeah, the reaction's been quite positive. It's helping validate some of the thinking that they already had, but more generating interest and enthusiasm around the programs that they're running around their contingent workforce, which is helping with adoption and expansion and ultimately leading to benefits for their business. So from that point of view, it's empowering and enabling some of the C-level execs to do more planning around these kinds of activities to get better outcomes. So it's been a really positive thing and being very well received.
Well, I think you mentioned a key point, and that is that adoption and scale is such a big issue with these programs, right? And this research is really a tool to help practitioners and people that really understand this and understand the value. It helps them internally sell this and gain visibility and understanding within their enterprises. So that's actually been one of the unintended positive consequences that we've heard a lot of customers come back and say, gosh, this has really been so useful because now I've got something that I can use to share internally, which is really helping bridge conversations with people that really haven't had an understanding or visibility to this before.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about our first theme. Theme 1 is the rise of the multi-channel workforce. Molly, why don't you talk a little bit about this and kind of unpack this concept?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that organizations are relying on a number of different channels and ways in which they're getting work done. And I think that we sought to understand, what are these different channels, how are they using them in combination, where are they seeing that they're going to be increasing their use of these various channels, and then, which ones really are standing out as kind of dominating or growing the most. And we have uncovered a few interesting things here. I mean, I think bottom line is that they all are increasing because we talked about earlier that their use of external workers, non-payroll workers and service providers is increasing in terms of how organizations get work done. But some of these are increasing faster than others over the next few years. So we'll talk about that more in a few minutes.
And Chris, what about Australia? Because one of the things that has been most fascinating for us is just looking around the world at various industry different, what's been different from an industry perspective, and then also what's different from a geography perspective. Companies are getting work done differently depending on industry again and geography. What are you seeing in Australia with regard to this, with the different channels that are being used to source external workers and services providers?
Yeah, it definitely is a slightly different market to Europe or the Americas, but we're seeing not a shift away, but I guess organisations supplementing their workforce channels rather than just staying with the traditional recruitment agency models. There is a limited supply in resources. We saw through the mining boom over recent years that when there is a particular industry boom, the need to source resources means need to be creative. So we're seeing companies that are typically used to having a big, large-scale program start to look at a more agile approach to how they're bringing workers into the organisation and the type of work they're being engaged for. So rather than looking at bringing a contractor in for a 6-month engagement, they'll bring them in to deliver outcomes. So looking at freelancers, organisations or businesses like Fiverr and Freelancer are becoming a lot more popular, where individuals are just being engaged to deliver a very short-term outcome. We're actually seeing the supply in the market in that space start to grow significantly as well. We're seeing this more being adopted by private industry. They're taking the lead on this. They're using freelancers more readily. They're a lot more comfortable and confident. Government, state and federal governments are a little bit slower to adopt because of, I guess, the security implications and the way that traditional government procurement works. However, we are seeing a drive where not just necessarily from a business point of view, you're looking at where you're bringing your resources in and what your supply channels are, but also where the resources actually are sitting. A lot of the contingent workforce now are really open to looking at these freelancer type engagements.
That's interesting. So Molly, you had mentioned that all these channels are growing. So why don't we talk about this? Because this is actually something that we saw consistently globally. And every region we looked at, there was significant growth anticipated for all of these channels. Chris, why don't you talk first about Australia in terms of we're seeing this huge growth in online marketplaces, right? These on-demand online marketplaces for freelancers, giving organizations the ability to actually go direct to a talent pool. Could you comment about that in terms of the nuances of the Australia market?
Yeah, I think that there's a big move to digitise and to use these types of channels in the Australian market. The Australians are typically very early adopters of new technology and new things, and because the size and scale of our organisations is a little bit smaller, when you look at a global perspective, it's a little bit easier to adopt some of these changes. So we're seeing that organisations are starting to look and become much more digital when it comes to sourcing talent. And again, it goes back to some of the comments I made before, where you're looking at some of the younger generations are making themselves available through those freelancer marketplaces. So the ability to tap into those and achieve the outcomes you need for your project are quite essential. So, Fieldglass, as part of our program, is now bringing that together. It's allowing that multi-channel workforce to be accessed through the solution, bringing those workers in. So from an Australian perspective, we're certainly seeing a faster take-up and a push towards these digital channels.
Mm-hmm. Molly, did you want to comment on this from a global perspective? Some of those broader themes that we were seeing?
Yeah, and so, I mentioned earlier that when you look at these data points, for example, the on-demand digital marketplaces are obviously going to more than triple in the next 3 years. And you also see a sustained kind of strong performance in service providers as a dominant source of talent. Obviously, all of these are increasing, but I called attention to those two in particular because those are very strong. And one of the reasons why is that this really gives an organization the exposure and the access to digital natives and next generation top talent that they might not be able to recruit on their own, and they are turning to these different platforms and service providers who are becoming very specialized. They're proliferating, and they're specializing in all aspects of the talent supply chain, if you will. So it's not too surprising to see how much they're growing, but the fact that it's going to more than triple in a few years was actually much higher than what we saw globally. Also, what you're seeing is that that this really takes advantage of what workers are preferring to do, increasingly wanting to work in a much more flexible way, perhaps as a contractor versus an employee. I mean, they're actually choosing to do this more, and so as they're doing this, one other thing that is a factor that we're seeing is that globalization of the labor supply is creating greater access to talent. So a lot of these forces are in motion now that are kind of changing the landscape for organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, those were two of our top global trends, which no matter how we slice the data, if we looked at the top 2 ranks, the top 3 ranks, the top 4 ranks, the ability of talent that prefers to work on a contract basis versus being an employee, that number was number 1 and followed very closely with globalization, as you're talking about the globalization of labor supply, creating that greater access. A lot of that enabled by digital channels. Those are two very, very strong themes. When I mentioned at the start, we looked at some of the global labor trends. Those really stood out. Chris, do you have any final comments that you want to make with regard to Australia?
I think in the Australian market, when you talk about accessing talent, organisations years ago started to holistically outsource programs, and there was pushback from a public perspective. There was a real negative perception around accessing those global markets and doing wholesale outsourcing. We're now seeing that resistance is starting to drop, and the introduction of the use of global freelancers is starting to increase, which is again reflected in the survey results, where you're seeing the talent sourcing expecting to be 85% online demand for freelancers. That in itself shows that the market is now starting to accept these offshoring or outsourcing of work to international locations more than what it has previously. There's obviously, again, limitations when you reflect on government and what they can do, but even government, in particular federal government, are now starting to run programs to work out how they move forward in this space over time, because they accept that this is where the market is actually going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there has been a big move. Public opinion is definitely changing on this, and it is interesting to see how it is creeping into the government sector. So let's go now to our next theme, or theme 2 is it's about the core. And this is one of our kind of headline findings, and that is that, 70%, when you think about it, 70% of executives in Australia said that their external workforce is critical to operating at full capacity and meeting market demands. And then 50% said that they would be unable to conduct business as usual without their external workforce. I mean, these are significant numbers, and they're a tad higher than the global numbers. Globally, the full capacity meeting market needs was around 65%, and the inability to conduct business as usual was 46%. So, Chris, do these numbers surprise you for Australia?
No, not at all. This definitely aligns with what we see across our local customers here. So whether it's across government, mining, telco, these organisations are now heavily reliant on external workers to staff core functions across their business. The talent serves in roles that are critical for the enterprise. They just can't do without them. I think you made the point earlier that sometimes it's just about keeping the lights on. If the external workforce left, the lights would go out for a lot of businesses. Examples are factory workers, oil rig workers, IT consultants, data scientists, financial managers, claims adjusters, programmers, marketers. Like, there's a huge list of individuals or skills that are part of the core, are part of keeping the lights on, that are now fulfilled by external workers. And I believe that's just going to increase over time. But we're certainly seeing that this is what's happening with our customer base now.
And Molly, why don't you hop in here? I think this is probably a good time to point out. We asked about the workforce spend, and we asked organizations around the world and in Australia, how much they spend on external workers, services providers, and employees. Why don't you share those numbers with our audience?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, globally, our finding was that 44% of the spend on workforce spend overall is on external forms of talent, external talent. And it is actually a little bit higher in Australia. 48% of the workforce spend is on the external workforce. So that's nearly half of what you're spending on overall on workforce across the organization. And so with the importance, clearly, of the external workforce and how it is, in fact, operating at the core, and with that kind of scale, these workers are essential, and they really are helping these companies keep the lights on, operate as business as usual, but also achieve some of their more important strategic business performance and financial targets that they have to hit. So hence the reason why they are operating at the core.
Another facet of this is when it comes to sourcing hard-to-find skills, because we asked a lot of questions to probe at, is there a skills shortage? What types of skills are most in demand? What do you have now? What don't you have now? What do you anticipate not having in the future? And when we looked at hard-to-find skills, we found that more than 2/3 of executives in Australia said that they absolutely rely on their external workforce for sourcing these skills that are in short supply, that they just have a hard time getting. But what was interesting, and this was very much in line with the global findings, was that 98%, or nearly all of them, said that that's going to be the case in 3 years. So does this point to a global skills shortage? It certainly, we know that the labor markets are very tight in many geographies around the world. So this is a huge number, and this is something that organizations need to think about in terms of doing their overall workforce planning, anticipating what are those skills we're going to need in the future, and how are we going to get them? Because from a competitive standpoint, if you don't have the skills you need to get what you need done, then you are at a competitive disadvantage. Molly, do you want to expand a little bit? I thought some of the findings on the kinds of skills that organizations thought they didn't have, I think those were pretty interesting.
Yeah, I did as well. they talked about having a tough time finding data-driven decision-making skills and the more analytical skills. Also, design thinking and new product development, user experience, and intellectual property protection. So, yes, certainly there are some other skill sets that everyone is competing for as they conduct various, they're transforming their enterprise to operate in the digital age. But certainly some of these skills as well have a lot to do with just, the new products that they're bringing to market, the user experiences and the customer experiences that they're creating, their ability to make decisions, their ability to keep their intellectual property safe and secure. So these are some tough to find skills, I think, all over the world, but particularly in Australia.
So, Chris, when you talk with executives about their business needs and the needs for platforms to help them manage their external workforce, and what do you hear about from executives around skills? I mean, do you get the sense that they're concerned about getting the skills they need to be competitive in the future?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing companies dealing with shortages in the labour market and skills shortages. They're having to go external to source skills, whether they like to or not, if they want to keep working, particularly in the industries that they're in. If you consider, again, going back, reflecting on things like the mining boom, there were a lot of lessons learned around how that skewed the market pricing and things like that. Organisations had to go externally. There are now demand for skills like the ones that Molly just covered off that are driving price and availability, but also the talent in the market are understanding their value a little bit more, and therefore, again, not wanting to be a traditional employee and opportunistically take advantage of the fact that there is now freelancer marketplaces and the like, and that organisations are sourcing from those spaces. So we're definitely seeing now that shortage of skills is driving the behaviour of the marketplace, and organisations are having to go to their external workforce to bring the right talent in at the right time.
And that's actually a good segue for us to go to our next theme. So our third theme is cost is not the whole story. Molly touched on this earlier. We're going to go into this in a little bit more detail, but this is all around business impact. So, while will always be important, managing costs are always going to be important, it's just one driver. And there are a battery of other business goals that executives see are their external workforce contributing to. Molly, do you want to just drain these Australia findings a little bit? Take us through these.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The chief concern that we see in Australia is really operating at full capacity and meeting market demands. And this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise based on some of the prior findings we were talking about, how core these workers are. But the other thing that was really different here was that managing costs and reducing risk were a little higher, as is achieving sustainability goals a little bit higher in the rankings compared to globally, whereas globally, for example, developing or improving products and services, increasing speed to market, and organizational agility were a little bit higher. But in general, these are the top considerations that really connect the external workforce to business improvement. But just those changes there, they're all pretty high, as you can see. There's not a huge amount of difference between them, but they are. But definitely, Australia is more concerned with managing cost and reducing risk and sustainability goals. So I think maybe it would be good to know a little bit more about why that is.
Yeah, Chris, what's your take on that?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing businesses in Australia are very cost conscious, particularly because there are higher operating costs, just simply being as remote as we are from the rest of the world, but also the way our labour market operates and the population and all sorts of other things. So, Australian businesses need to be cost conscious to compete on the global scale. they can achieve these cost reductions by better planning and better management of the way they're sourcing resources and other activities as well.
Okay, and let's move on to theme 4. Visibility is everything. And I think we all know that a fundamental truth of business is that you can't manage what you don't measure, and you can't measure what you can't see. So the lack of visibility to the external workforce is really a serious problem for most companies. You know, we asked executives how informed they are about a variety of aspects of their non-payroll workers and their services providers. And the results are actually pretty similar, so we just chose, in the essence of time, we just chose to show you the responses for non-payroll workers. Molly, why don't you talk us through this?
Yeah, I think that, this what really stands out here is that less than half of executives have visibility to these very key factors for their external workforce. Asking a little bit about what are they working on? What are the rates that they're paying? Are we complying with negotiated rates? What is the quality? What systems are they accessing? And what is their interaction with confidential information? And frankly, who are they? Right? So definitely is an area for opportunity, a lot of upside in improving visibility. And as you said, Karen, if you can't really derive as big of a benefit out of something that you really can't see, right? So I think the other side, the flip side of this coin is there's a lot of upside opportunity to improve this. Absolutely.
So, Chris, what's your take on this for Australia? Do you is this a surprise to you as you've gone around and talked with various companies? And actually, you're an ex-practitioner too, right? So
I am. It's my background.
Idea, yeah. So this has a special place in your heart, right?
It does. Look, this doesn't surprise me at all. Visibility is a significant issue for organisations, and when you talk about visibility, it's not necessarily just knowing who's on site. It's about things like think about hospitals hire contract nurses. Are all their certifications current? Are they registered? Factories hiring contract workers. Are all their safety certifications up to date and current? We've got oil and gas exploration, mining, other heavy industries in Australia. They require specialised skills and capabilities. Is the training up to date that the individuals have done? Do the leaders and managers within an organisation know, and can they see what access people have to mission critical systems? If you onboard a worker, are they also being offboarded correctly and in the right time when they leave, or are they still having access to your solutions, your mission critical systems after they've left? We actually had one example where we had a customer who asked us to help gain visibility into their external workforce. They indicated to us they had a workforce of around 7,000 people. After we deployed Fieldglass, we discovered that they had more than 16,000 external workers, so more than double, nearly triple what they were talking about and counting. So those numbers are still growing as the program expands. But what was alarming about this is the workers have access to their data, their systems, networks, email addresses, etc. So this was only just about finding about who was there, let alone what they're doing and how much they're getting paid. Who's the first step? The rest sort of comes through. So yeah, we're absolutely seeing a big focus on this visibility and the need to understand who your workforce is. Are they qualified? Do they have the right skills, certifications? And should they continue in the role? And are you safe as an organisation if they do?
That's right. So we've just covered basically the four forces that we have, right? These four themes. So the multi-channel workforce is on the rise. It's about the core. Cost is not the whole story, and visibility is everything. What we want to do next is, we did a leader cut in our study, and we call these the pace setters. And it's basically 1 in 10 companies that responded to our survey, and we felt they developed markedly superior performance in how they managed their workforce and how they extracted value. And we feel like they're charting the way forward for others. I mean, this is still an evolving field. They're not perfect at all. In fact, Molly, why don't you talk a little bit about what we discovered with regard from our pacesetter cut?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I thought this was really interesting because, in fact, we segmented our respondents into these 4 groups: beginners, followers, fast followers, and pace setters. And each group represents an increasing level of rigor in the successful management of their external workforce. So we're highlighting the pace setters here, and they really stand out in 3 important ways. One is that they are highly informed about the things that are important to their business: labor and pay rates, compliance, the nature of work that's actually being done, its duration, the access to their systems, quality. I mean, so they are highly informed about these factors. And so obviously visibility, that goes back to our point about visibility. The second is they frankly find it easier to manage their external workforce. And of course, if you can see more of it, you're going to have an easier time managing it. So it does follow that it is easier to manage all aspects of the workforce, so that you can find and deploy your high quality resources at the right time, the right place, and at the right rate. And so forth. So they just frankly have an easier time managing. And then really it has to do with the last point here is about the business impacts of these workers. And what they're saying here and what they're showing us in the data is that their external workforce enables them to improve their company's financial and business performance and really compete a whole lot better in a digital world. So they can see these things. And again, these go back to some of the points we made earlier about operating at the core and having and accessing the kind of skills through the external workforce that are going to fundamentally help you compete and achieve your business goals. So they're just doing it at a much higher scale. So I think we get into that in a little bit more detail in just a minute.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So this is, I think, a great intro. And so now what we'll do is we'll go look a little deeper into these areas. So we'll look into unpack visibility, then we'll unpack effective management, and then we'll go look at business impact. So here, and again, we looked at this for non-payroll workers and for services providers, and the results were somewhat similar, but here we're just showing non-payroll workers. And this shows the Australia vis-a-vis pay setters and non-pay setters. And Molly, why don't you talk us through these and pull out some of the highlights around visibility for Australia?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, the blue bar there, those are the pace setters. The non-pace setters are the orange, and that really is the beginner, follower, and fast follower segments that I mentioned earlier. And then Australia is in purple. And so you can see that they are highly informed. Pace setters are highly informed about responsibilities, labor rates, compliance with negotiated rates, quality of work, access to systems, who they are. But you can see how Australia then compares with the non-pace setters. So obviously there are some real upsides. Some are somewhat equivalent, but there's a lot of upside opportunity here to improve.
Oh, Chris, what do you think? Does this surprise you? These findings?
No surprises. Well, I guess we're seeing that we have a lot of conversations with our customers around rate compliance and quality of work. There's certainly key topics that are talked about a lot. Access to systems and confidential information as well seem to concern a lot of the execs when they're talking about their workforce. So we see companies are absolutely wanting to drive improvement in these areas to compete more in the global market, and that they see that they need to start with visibility across these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is definitely the first step. Well, let's move on to management. So we also asked executives about the challenges they face with managing their external workforce. And so this question was really around both services providers and non-payroll workers. Molly, why don't you talk about this? Because you'll see that the pay setters generally outperform the rest of our respondents. Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I call your attention to the first one there, which is inconsistencies in talent or project quality. And here, obviously, it's quite strong in terms of, their ability to weather and manage any sort of challenges they have in this area, as compared to the non-pay setters in Australia, which are fairly close in performance there. And then I'll jump down to, finding high-quality resources at the right rate. And again here, I thought what was interesting is that everybody was sort of on par. The non-pay setters being a little bit more challenged here, but I thought it was interesting that Australia was here right, even with the pay setters, which I thought was pretty great. And then tracking resource and project quality. Again, I mean, this is where this is one of the they came out actually higher here in pay setters versus Australia.
I guess this is one of the reasons why you want to look at Fieldglass. Can't help but put a plug in for our solutions. Companies struggle getting the right talent at the right place at the right cost. So if you can do that, you're increasing your project outcomes. If you're always getting the third best candidate in your recruitment processes, you're going to start to have problems with the overall productivity and outcomes for your workforce. So in Australia, because we've got a tight labour market, sourcing is a huge challenge, just simply because of the competitiveness. Then you want to track quality, so you can work then with your suppliers and the same people that you've worked with previously to try and build capability in your workforce, whilst also ensuring that you don't keep bringing back those workers that haven't done a great job. So yeah, this is absolutely something that SAP Fieldglass drives outcomes in.
Well, and this all drives to value, right? I mean, that value and business outcomes are the name of the game. And in all research that you do, you always have your hopes and aspirations when you really hope the data is going to tell you, but you never know. And we actually found this to be fascinating because the third aspect of what we saw with these pay setters is that yes, they have better visibility. Yes, they manage better. They, have far fewer problems than everyone else generally. But they also outperform the pack when it comes to the financial and business performance objectives they realize. And they are more inclined to say, yes, my external workforce helps me compete in the digital world. Molly, why don't you comment on these particular findings?
Yeah, so, in this particular case, the Australia, Karen, I'm going to defer to you on this because I'm not seeing this.
Sure. Well, I think the whole concept here is that the broader concept is that, when we ran and crunched these numbers with Oxford, we found that there was a huge correlation between better visibility, better management, and business impact. So with regard to Australia, if you look at enabling our organization to improve, our overall financial performance, Australia was in line with non-pay setters. So they weren't anywhere near the pay setters. And the second lever, when we looked at enabling our workforce being a key lever and enabling our business performance, you'll see Australia actually better than non-pay setters and almost pay setter. So Australian executives were more likely to say, yeah, it's a key lever for enabling my business performance. And then the third peg here was, well, does your external workforce help you compete in a digital world? And remember, we anchor back to, and we asked this is a very specific question, but we asked a lot about digital skills, data-driven decision-making, user experience, AI, blockchain, IoT. We asked about those skills, but we specifically said, hey, does it help you compete? And interestingly enough, Australia said yes. I mean, more so than pace setters. So Australian executives really do see the external workforce as critical to competing in this world that we now define as being digitally driven. Chris, how does this meet or line up with what you're hearing from executives with regard to their skills and competitiveness and thinking about this workforce overall?
Yeah. So this is really pleasing to see because it's exactly what we experience on the ground here in the Australian market. We do see that organisations absolutely see the value and benefits of utilising an external workforce. And those organisations that are utilising an external workforce and managing visibility of that workforce and performance are realising the most value. They're seeing huge benefits for their business and, again, becoming a pace setter. So, yeah, this research is great to see because it absolutely aligns with what we see in the market on a daily basis.
So this is probably good. I'm looking at our time here. This is probably, why don't we close with some recommendations for those of us who've joined the call, in terms of, what does this mean for, companies today? And, what can people be doing to realize better value from their external workforce? So I know there are a couple things that when we distilled down our findings and recommendations, we came up with 4 things that we think companies should be focusing on. Chris, do you want to talk through these?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think you can be distilled down into a couple of key points, but the first being, visibility is absolutely the key. That's the starting point. You can't manage what you don't measure, and if you can't see it, if you don't even know how many workers you've got, or you can't report on this, then that's a fairly significant issue. Second item is to know where your external workforce adds value. Understand the benefits and the value that they can bring to your organisation, both in your core components of your enterprise and externally. Third, anticipate what skills you need in the future and develop a strategy across permanent and external workforce to source those skills. So workforce planning is becoming more critical, and understanding how to tap into the multi-channel workforce and leverage what is a changing talent marketplace where individuals are no longer just looking for permanent full-time work. Your organisation needs to understand how to tap into those markets and access that talent. The last point is embrace the external workforce for their skills, ideas and contributions. It's no longer frowned upon adopting and bringing in external workers and utilising them to help build an organisation's capability and deliver outcomes is absolutely critical going forward. I think organisations that aren't yet embracing or are avoiding the use of external workers are going to be left behind. The rest of the market that are and are becoming market leaders. There's certainly the 4 key things that I'd suggest are the things to focus on.
Mm-hmm. And Molly, I know you've talked a lot about holistic workforce strategy because that's been one of the key findings in our research. Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I have talked about it because, what we're finding here is that only 25% of executives in Australia say that they have a holistic talent strategy that encompasses both the employee and external workforce. So the concern here is that, with the acceleration of spend on external talent, and through all of the forms that we've talked about earlier, we know that, from an historical study that we had done, that our colleagues in SuccessFactors had done actually, that they were saying back in 2014, HR executives said we believe that the external workforce needs to be a bigger part of our talent strategy in general across the board. Well, fast forward to 2018, and we're still seeing that only 25% of them say that they actually have this holistic talent strategy in place. So obviously, there's a huge upside opportunity, but I think the imperative is here. It's going to continue to increase. It is operating at the core of the business. So it is something that both HR and procurement really need to take a hard look at coming together around those things.
Mm-hmm. And are there any big takeaways that you'd like for people to think about with regard to what we've learned from doing this research in the market?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing that I believe everybody needs to take stock of is that the workforce has fundamentally changed. The modern workforce does not look like what it looked like years ago. And so if you are embracing that or preparing your organization to embrace that change, you're obviously taking a good hard look at the spend on external talent and what is needed over the coming years, and is this growing? And if it is growing, then you really are looking at your workforce in a completely new way, and your planning is going to change, obviously, as part of that. It used to be years ago, and we talked about this, that cost was the core driver, and of course it's still important. But the fact is that external workers and service providers are providing a rich well of talent to help drive business outcomes. So these critical business outcomes are, yes, products and services to market, agility, speed to market, and this really this is more than just cost. So that is an adjustment that we have to make in our thinking about the workforce. And then I think organizations need to be thinking about the external workforce as a key access point to the critical skills they need for these core operations that we talked about, and also preparing for growth in the digital world. So this is something that all organizations are going through, digital transformation on one level or another, and access to these hot skills that we've talked about earlier is going to be key, and the external workforce is going to be a critical means to doing that. And then also, if given all that we've just said here, this topic of the external workforce really should be a C-suite imperative. It is, spend and reliance on all forms of talent on your total workforce obviously is something that is increasing in importance as a topic in the organizations, but it should be on the C-suite agenda, and it should have the same amount of rigor applied to it as is to the internal workforce. So it just needs to get a much better spotlight, a bigger spotlight on it, in addition to the internal workforce.
Yeah, when you think about the numbers of, that nearly 50% of workforce spend is on the external workforce, and all of these business outcomes and the value, frankly, that is untapped right now, right? There's a lot of untapped value. I mean, this is definitely something that the C-suite should be paying attention to. And so I guess for everyone here who's listening on the call, I mean, hopefully this, research is providing you with some great data to take this information to your C-suite, to senior leadership, to talk with them about this, this critical resource and critical asset for companies today. And obviously, the way work is getting done is changing dramatically and has changed. Chris, any parting thoughts before we wrap it up, and we'll see if we have any questions?
I guess if this has sparked interest from anybody on the call, we're happy to provide from a professional services perspective some further insights or information that might be relevant to particular organisations and helping engage their C-level execs. So certainly happy if people want to connect and reach out to discuss or engage further over this. But it really is, the workforce is changing, planning's critical, and this research really does assist in understanding where you need to focus some of that planning.
I'll also comment too, in working very closely with Oxford on this. I mean, they really felt like when they saw the 44, 48% number in terms of the spend, they said, this is top of the fold news. They're like, this is one of the most important business stories of our time. I mean, they felt so, thought that this was so compelling, and were really surprised, frankly, that this is not a part of a workforce discussion in all C-suites today, especially given the tight labor markets, especially given how critical these skills are viewed in terms of, and to the dynamic of so many people wanting to work this way. Businesses aren't really choosing this in many respects. This is just the way things are now. So we found this to be very exciting.
Karen, just to build on that, I've been out talking with customers and other, colleagues throughout SAP, and they are equally surprised at the 44% globally and 48% of workforce spend is so significant, almost half. It is surprising, and that amount is surprising, but also when you compare that with the fact that there is relatively low visibility across the board of the specifics behind it, it's easy to have that sort of spend creep up on you until it becomes more than half of your workforce spend, and it certainly is approaching that now.
Well, that's been, and before I make a comment, I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to, pop them in the chat window. But we did find that it's, this has crept up, as we've been talking with customers and other folks in the marketplace. And, as Oxford has chatted up these findings within their very significant business network, the sense is that this has crept up. It's just been something that's been happening in such a fragmented way in organizations. Very few organizations actually have all this centralized. In fact, we think that even the services spend is probably quite low because it's just managed very differently in organizations and frankly not visible. It's just not visible. So it'll be very interesting over the next few years to watch this space and see how this does, land in the C-suite agenda. So I do not see any questions. So we are going to post this webcast on our website, and there's also a slide share which goes into a little more detail. If you want to also go to our website, you'll see a copy of our full report. We've got slide shares, infographics. And we are happy if anybody would love for us to present the research to any of your colleagues or executives, please definitely let us know. We're very, very happy to share this. I just want to let you know that we really appreciate everyone joining us today and making time for us. And I hope you have a wonderful Friday and a lovely weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.